They laughed when I asked about overseas shipping, called me little girl, and said maybe I should stick to domestic mail. The postal clerk smirked and told my parents they might want to handle the complicated stuff for me. But when that same clerk saw my credentials and snapped to attention with a sharp salute, his face went ghost white. Want to know what made a career postal worker suddenly treat a 20-something woman like visiting royalty, and why my parents finally understood why I'd been so secretive about my government job? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as we stood in line at the downtown postal facility. It was one of those government buildings that seemed designed to crush your soul. Beige walls, worn linoleum floors that had seen better decades, and the persistent smell of ink and desperation that clung to every surface. My parents flanked me on either side, Dad checking his watch for the third time in 2 minutes while Mom rearranged the contents of her purse with the nervous energy she reserved for doctor's appointments and tax audits. I clutched the manila envelope containing documents that couldn't be emailed, couldn't be faxed, and definitely couldn't wait for regular mail. The kind of paperwork that required signatures in multiple countries and clearances that most people didn't know existed. My parents thought I worked in cultural exchange programs for the State Department, which wasn't technically a lie, just an oversimplification that let them sleep better at night. The truth was more complicated. 3 years of assignments that took me to places where American tourists needed emergency evacuations, where embassy staff required protection during political upheavals, and where certain conversations happened in rooms that weren't supposed to exist. But as far as Mom and Dad knew, I helped organize student exchange programs and cultural festivals. "Next in line," called out the postal clerk, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Douglas in faded plastic letters. He had the look of someone who'd been working the same job for 20 years and found personal satisfaction in making other people's simple tasks unnecessarily complicated. Thinning hair, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and the slightly superior expression of someone who knew all the rules and enjoyed watching people fail to navigate them properly. I approached the counter with the envelope, my parents following close behind like backup singers ready to jump into harmony. Douglas looked at me with the kind of automatic dismissal that service workers sometimes reserved for young women who looked like they might not understand how the real world operated. "What can I do for you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else. "I need to send this to the embassy in Prague," I said, placing the envelope on the counter with the care reserved for fragile things. "It's time-sensitive diplomatic correspondence." Douglas picked up the envelope like it was contaminated, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated skepticism. "Diplomatic correspondence?" He chuckled, glancing at my parents with the kind of look that said, "Kids these days think everything is important." "Sure it is. What you've got here is just a regular envelope. Priority mail to Czech Republic will run you about $45 and take 7 to 10 business days." "It's not regular mail," I explained patiently. "It's official government business that requires expedited diplomatic channels." "Listen, sweetheart," Douglas said, his condescension dripping like honey from a broken jar. "I've been doing this job since before you were born. I know diplomatic mail when I see it, and this isn't it. You can't just slap diplomatic on something and expect special treatment." My father stepped forward, trying to be helpful in that way parents do when they think their adult children need backup. "My daughter works for the government," he said proudly. "She does important work with international programs." Douglas's smile widened, but not in a good way. "I'm sure she does very important work," he said with mock seriousness. "But unless you've got official diplomatic credentials and proper documentation, this is just regular international mail, no exceptions." "I have credentials," I said quietly. "Sure you do, honey. And I'm the Secretary of State." Douglas turned to address my parents directly, as if I was no longer capable of participating in adult conversation. "Look, folks, I get it. Your daughter probably does some kind of office work for a government contractor or something, maybe files paperwork for visa applications. But that doesn't make her a diplomat. You want to send this envelope overseas, we can do that, but it goes through regular channels like everyone else's mail." The woman behind us in line snorted with amusement. "Some people think they're so special," she muttered to her companion. Probably works at the DMV and thinks she's running foreign policy. My mother's face flushed with embarrassment, not for me, but for the situation. She'd raised me to be polite, to respect authority figures, to not make scenes in public. "Maybe we should just pay the $45, she whispered. But I was done being polite. "Douglas," I said, using his name with the kind of calm precision that made seasoned embassy security guards pay attention. "I'm going to need you to check your diplomatic pouch protocols." "My what now?" He laughed outright. "Lady, we don't have diplomatic pouches here. This is a regular post office, not the United Nations. Every postal facility that handles international mail has diplomatic pouch procedures," I continued in the same measured tone. "They're outlined in your operational manual, Section 15C, subsection 4. You might want to review them." Douglas's smile faltered slightly, not because he believed me, but because I'd cited specific sections of postal regulations that most customers wouldn't know existed. "Look, I don't know where you're getting your information, but check your system for diplomatic routing codes," I interrupted gently. "Prague Embassy, Diplomatic Pouch Authorization. The codes are DP7751 through DP7755. Now Douglas looked genuinely confused. Those weren't numbers I should have known if I was just some office worker pretending to be important. He turned to his computer terminal, fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "I don't need to check anything. If you want to send this envelope, it goes through regular mail." "Then I'll need to speak with your postmaster," I said. "The postmaster is busy with real postal business, not playing pretend with someone who watched too many spy movies." Douglas was getting defensive now, which meant he was starting to doubt himself but couldn't back down in front of an audience. "You want to send this or not?" My father was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the confrontation. He'd spent his career in middle management, avoiding conflicts and keeping his head down. Public arguments made him break out in a nervous sweat. "Sweetie, maybe we should just—" "No, Dad." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my identification wallet, the one I carried for situations exactly like this. Not my regular driver's license and credit cards, but the other one. The one with credentials that opened doors in government buildings and made security checkpoints operate differently. Douglas watched with skeptical amusement as I flipped open the leather folder. "Let me guess, you've got a fake ID that says you're a secret agent or something?" But his expression changed as he looked at the credentials. The official seals, the photograph, the clearance levels printed in small, precise text. The kind of identification that couldn't be faked because most people didn't even know what the real ones looked like. "Major Sarah Thompson, U.S. Diplomatic Security Service," I said quietly. "Defense Attaché Office, European Division. Now can we discuss the diplomatic pouch?" The silence that followed was the kind that makes fluorescent lights seem impossibly loud. Douglas stared at my credentials like they were written in a foreign language, his mouth working soundlessly as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. My parents looked at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not pride exactly, and not confusion, but something closer to recognition, like they were finally seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're a major?" my mother whispered. "In the Army Reserve," I confirmed, still watching Douglas, who had gone pale enough that the fluorescent lights made him look slightly green. "Active duty with the Diplomatic Security Service. I provide protection for embassy personnel and handle sensitive communications between diplomatic posts." Douglas fumbled with his computer keyboard, suddenly eager to check those routing codes I'd mentioned. His fingers shook slightly as he typed, and when the results appeared on his screen, his face went from pale to white. "Oh, God," he breathed. "You're actually— the diplomatic pouch protocols are—" I didn't realize. He looked up at me with wide eyes. "Ma'am, I apologize. I didn't understand the nature of your shipment." The transformation was immediate and complete. The condescending postal clerk disappeared, replaced by someone who suddenly understood that he'd been arguing with a federal officer about procedures he barely comprehended. Douglas straightened his shoulders and looked at me with the kind of respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "What can I do to expedite your diplomatic correspondence, Major Thompson?" The woman behind us in line had gone quiet. The casual observer who'd been enjoying the show of some young woman getting put in her place by an experienced postal worker was now witnessing a complete reversal of fortune. She studied my face with new interest, probably wondering what other assumptions she'd made incorrectly about the people around her. The documents need to reach the Prague embassy within 72 hours, I explained. They're related to an ongoing security assessment that affects American personnel in the region. Douglas nodded vigorously, suddenly an expert on diplomatic urgency. Absolutely, ma'am. Let me process this through our diplomatic channels immediately. He took the envelope, with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for handling crystal. There's no charge for official diplomatic correspondence, of course. My father was staring at me like I'd just revealed I could fly. Security assessment? He repeated faintly. I evaluate threat levels for embassy staff, I explained, which was another oversimplification but closer to the truth than cultural exchange programs. When political situations change or security risks increase, I assess whether American personnel need additional protection or evacuation. Like in the movies? Mom asked, still processing. More like in the boring government reports that come after the movie ends, I said with a smile. A lot of paperwork, threat analysis, and coordination with local security forces. Occasionally travel to places where the State Department needs an extra set of eyes. Douglas had been working frantically at his computer, processing my diplomatic shipment with the efficiency of someone who'd suddenly remembered he was a federal employee dealing with official government business. Major Thompson, your correspondence will be in Prague tomorrow morning, local time. The diplomatic pouch goes out on tonight's flight, and embassy staff will receive it through secure channels. Thank you, Douglas. I appreciate your assistance. He beamed at me like I'd just given him a commendation medal. My pleasure, ma'am. Always happy to support our diplomatic personnel. He paused, then added with genuine curiosity, if you don't mind me asking, how long have you been with the Diplomatic Security Service? 3 years active duty, 5 years total, including reserve time. I accepted the receipt he handed me with the kind of official stamps and tracking numbers that regular mail never received. I started right after graduate school. Graduate school in what? My mother asked, joining the conversation with the tone she used when she was trying to catch up on family news she'd somehow missed. International Relations and Security Studies. Georgetown. I looked at my parents, seeing their confused expressions, and realized how much of my life had been edited for their peace of mind. The same degree program that trains most diplomatic security officers. My father was doing calculations in his head, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the federal officer standing in front of him. When you said you were doing cultural exchange work, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That was part of it. Embassy security includes cultural liaison responsibilities, especially when we're working with local law enforcement or government officials. I tucked my credentials back into my jacket, but mostly I assess security risks and coordinate protection for American personnel in potentially dangerous situations. Douglas had finished processing my shipment and was looking at me with something approaching awe. Ma'am, I've been working postal service for 22 years, and I've never actually met a diplomatic security officer. I always wondered what you folks were like. Pretty much like everyone else, just with more background checks and travel requirements. The places you must have seen, he continued, clearly fascinated. I bet you've got some stories. I smiled but didn't elaborate. The stories Douglas was imagining probably involved more excitement than reality. Most of my work consisted of coordinating with local police, reviewing security protocols, and writing reports that other people used to make policy decisions. But there had been moments, evacuating embassy staff during a political coup, providing security during high-risk diplomatic meetings, spending 3 weeks in a conflict zone assessing whether American personnel could safely remain in country. The woman behind us had been listening to this entire exchange with growing embarrassment. Her earlier comment about DMV workers thinking they ran foreign policy had backfired spectacularly, and she now found herself in line behind an actual federal officer who did, in fact, have some influence over foreign policy implementation. I apologize for my comment earlier, she said quietly. I didn't realize. No harm done, I replied. Most people don't encounter diplomatic security in their daily lives. There's no reason you would have known. My parents were still processing everything they'd learned about their daughter's actual job description. Mom kept looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time, while Dad had that expression he got when he was trying to solve a complex problem at work. The travel, Dad said slowly. All those trips you said were for conferences and training. Some were conferences and training. Others were assignments. I looked at them both, realizing how much I'd sanitized my career to keep them from worrying. I've been to 17 countries in the past 3 years, mostly in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Anywhere the State Department needs security assessments or personnel protection. Dangerous places. Mom asked with the tone that meant she was already starting to worry retroactively about every phone call where I'd sounded tired or stressed. Sometimes, but that's why they send people like me, to make those places safer for other Americans who need to be there. Douglas had been watching this family conversation with the fascination of someone witnessing a personal revelation in real time. "Major Thompson," he said, "I have to ask, how did you know about the diplomatic pouch procedures? Most people have never heard of them. Part of my training covers communication security and official correspondence protocols. I've used diplomatic pouches from embassy locations, but this was my first time initiating one from a domestic postal facility." I glanced around the post office with new appreciation. I wasn't sure if smaller facilities would have the proper systems in place. We do, but I'll be honest. I've never actually processed one before. Most diplomatic mail goes through larger facilities or directly from government buildings. Douglas was clearly proud to have handled his first official diplomatic correspondence. This will probably be the most interesting thing that happens in this office all year. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another postal worker, a supervisor who'd apparently been called to assist with the diplomatic shipment. She approached our counter with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to handling unusual situations. "Major Thompson?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Martinez, District Supervisor. Douglas mentioned you needed diplomatic pouch services." "That's correct. The shipment has already been processed." "Excellent. I wanted to personally ensure everything was handled properly." She looked at Douglas with approval. It's not often we get diplomatic correspondence at this facility. But Douglas followed all the correct procedures. Douglas straightened with visible pride at the supervisor's praise. The same man who'd been dismissive and condescending 20 minutes earlier was now beaming at having successfully processed official government business. "Ma'am," Patricia continued, addressing me, "if you anticipate needing regular diplomatic pouch services from this location, I can ensure our staff receives additional training on the protocols. We want to make sure we're properly supporting our diplomatic personnel." "I appreciate that, but this was likely a one-time situation. Most of my correspondence goes through embassy channels." I looked around the post office, noting how the dynamic had completely shifted. Other customers were watching our conversation with curiosity, some probably wondering why a young woman was receiving supervisor-level attention and formal courtesies typically reserved for visiting officials. My parents had been listening to this exchange in fascination. The daughter they'd thought worked in a glorified administrative role was being treated like a visiting dignitary by postal supervisors who used terms like diplomatic personnel and official government business. "Honey," my mother said quietly, "when you said you couldn't talk about work because of confidentiality agreements, I meant it. A lot of what I do involves classified information or sensitive diplomatic situations that can't be discussed publicly." I looked at both my parents, seeing the mixture of pride and concern in their expressions. "I know I've been vague about my job, but I wanted to protect you from worrying about things you couldn't control." My father nodded slowly. "The phone calls where you sounded exhausted and said you'd been traveling for work were usually after I'd spent 2 weeks in a conflict zone or finished evacuating embassy personnel from a dangerous situation." I saw the color drain from his face and quickly added, "But I'm trained for those situations, Dad. I'm not some civilian wandering into dangerous places unprepared. The Diplomatic Security Service has extensive training programs and support systems." Patricia had been listening to our family conversation with the discretion of someone accustomed to overhearing sensitive discussions. "Major Thompson, your parents should be very proud. Diplomatic security officers do vital work that most people never hear about. You keep our embassy staff safe and ensure American interests are protected in challenging environments." "Thank you," I replied, then looked at my parents. "Maybe we could continue this conversation over coffee. I have a feeling you both have questions." Douglas handed me a receipt with multiple official stamps and tracking numbers. "Ma'am, your diplomatic correspondence will reach Prague Embassy by tomorrow morning, as requested." Thank you for your service." The formal courtesy in his voice was genuine now, the automatic respect given to someone whose credentials carried real weight in the federal system. As we prepared to leave, other customers in line watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment, probably wondering what other assumptions they made about the people around them based on age, appearance, or demeanor. Walking out of the post office, my parents flanked me again, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of protective parents shepherding their adult child through bureaucratic complexity, they now seemed to be processing the revelation that their daughter held federal rank and carried responsibilities they'd never imagined. "So," my mother said as we reached the parking lot, "a major." "Yes, in the Army. Army Reserve, active duty with the Diplomatic Security Service. And you protect ambassadors and embassy staff." "Among other responsibilities, yes." Dad stopped walking and looked at me directly. "The times you said you couldn't talk about where you'd been or what you were doing were because I've been to places or handled situations that were classified or diplomatically sensitive." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm sorry I couldn't be more specific, but there are legal and security reasons for maintaining operational security." "How dangerous is this job, really?" Mom asked with the tone that meant she was already preparing to worry about every future phone call that came at odd hours or got cut short unexpectedly. "Sometimes very dangerous. Sometimes routine. Most of my work involves assessment and coordination rather than direct action, but when American personnel are at risk, we go wherever we're needed." I looked at both of them, seeing their concern, and decided they deserved complete honesty. "I've been in situations where we had to evacuate embassy staff under hostile conditions. I've provided security during diplomatic meetings in active conflict zones. But I've also spent weeks writing reports and coordinating with local police about traffic patterns around embassy buildings." "The travel," Dad said, still processing. "All those conferences and training sessions. Some were legitimate conferences and training. Others were cover stories for classified assignments. I felt the weight of years of edited phone calls and sanitized explanations. I know it seems like I've been lying to you, but operational security requirements mean I can't discuss specific assignments or locations, even with family." My mother was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you happy doing this work?" The question surprised me. "Yes. It's challenging and sometimes stressful, but I feel like I'm making a difference. American diplomats and aid workers can do their jobs because people like me assess security risks and coordinate protection when needed." "And you're good at it?" Dad asked. "Good enough that they keep sending me to complicated places and trusting me with important assignments." I smiled at them both. "Georgetown has an excellent program, and the Diplomatic Security Service training is comprehensive. I'm not improvising out there." Patricia Martinez appeared beside us, having followed us out of the building. "Excuse me, Major Thompson? I wanted to apologize personally for the initial confusion about your correspondence. Douglas is an experienced postal worker, but diplomatic protocols aren't something we encounter regularly." "No apology necessary. The situation was resolved professionally. I'd also like to ensure that if you need postal services in the future, you know you can contact me directly." She handed me a business card with her direct number. "Supporting our diplomatic personnel is a priority, and I want to make sure we provide appropriate service. I appreciate that, though as I mentioned, most of my correspondence goes through official channels." "Understood. But if you need local postal support for any reason, please don't hesitate to contact me personally." After Patricia returned to the building, my parents and I stood in the parking lot, processing everything that had just happened. The revelation of my actual job had shifted something fundamental in our relationship, and we were all trying to navigate this new understanding. "Coffee?" I suggested again. "Definitely," Mom replied. "I have about 100 questions. And I'll answer what I can," I promised. "But some things have to stay classified." "We understand," Dad said, though his expression suggested he was still adjusting to having a daughter whose work involved classified information and federal security clearances. As we walked toward our cars, I reflected on how quickly the situation in the post office had changed once my credentials were revealed. Douglas had gone from condescending dismissal to respectful efficiency in a matter of minutes. The other customers had shifted from amusement at watching someone get taken down a peg to curiosity about who they'd been observing. My parents had discovered their daughter held federal rank and carried responsibilities they'd never imagined. But the most significant change was in my own willingness to be honest about my work. For 3 years, I'd protected my parents from worrying about assignments they couldn't control or influence. I'd edited my stories, sanitized my experiences, and created cover stories that let them sleep peacefully while I worked in places where American personnel faced real dangers. The encounter with Douglas had forced me to reveal not just my credentials, but the reality of what those credentials represented. My parents would worry more now, but they'd also understand why I sometimes couldn't talk about my work, why my travel schedule was unpredictable, and why certain phone calls had to be brief or ended abruptly. "Major Thompson," my mother said as we reached our cars, testing out my rank like she was trying on new vocabulary. "You can still call me your daughter," I said with a smile. "Our daughter, the Major," Dad said, and I could hear both pride and concern in his voice. "Our daughter." "The federal officer who protects American diplomats and embassy staff," Mom corrected, clearly working to understand exactly what my job entailed. "Your daughter who loves you both and is sorry she couldn't be more honest about her work until now," I said. The coffee conversation that followed would be long and detailed, full of questions I could answer and others I couldn't, explanations about diplomatic security, and stories about places I'd been and people I'd protected. My parents would learn more about their daughter's actual career in one afternoon than they'd known in 3 years of carefully edited phone calls. But standing in that post office parking lot, watching them process the revelation that their child held federal rank and carried responsibilities they'd never imagined, I realized that sometimes respect has to be earned through demonstration rather than explanation. Douglas had needed to see credentials before he could adjust his assumptions. My parents had needed to witness the official courtesy and supervisor attention before they could understand that my government job was more significant than they'd realized. The diplomatic pouch would reach Prague by morning. Embassy staff would receive the security assessment documents through secure channels, and American personnel in the region would have the information they needed to make informed decisions about their safety. It was routine work in the larger context of diplomatic security, but it mattered to the people whose lives depended on accurate threat assessments and coordinated protection. And maybe, I thought as we prepared to drive to the coffee shop for a long overdue honest conversation about my actual career, it was time to stop protecting my parents from understanding the work I'd chosen and the responsibilities I'd accepted. They deserved to know who their daughter really was, even if it meant they'd worry more about phone calls from unfamiliar numbers and travel schedules that changed without warning. Sometimes the people who love us need to see our credentials too. The coffee shop smelled like roasted beans and possibility, the kind of local place where baristas knew regular customers by their usual orders and conversations could stretch for hours without anyone checking the time. My parents chose a corner table away from the afternoon rush, settling into chairs with the careful deliberation of people preparing for a conversation that would change everything they thought they knew about their daughter. Mom ordered her predictable vanilla latte, while Dad went with black coffee, strong enough to power industrial equipment. I chose something complicated with multiple shots of espresso, partly because I needed the caffeine, and partly because I was stalling for time while trying to figure out how to explain 3 years of carefully constructed cover stories. "So," Dad began after the barista delivered our drinks, "when you said you work for the State Department, I do work for the State Department. The Diplomatic Security Service is part of state." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, using the warmth to steady myself for what was coming. "I just let you assume it was all desk work and cultural programs." "But you're in the Army too." Mom's voice carried that tone she used when she was trying to solve puzzles with missing pieces. "How does that work exactly?" "Army Reserve gives me military rank and additional training that's useful for diplomatic security work. Most DSS agents have military backgrounds because the job requires skills that civilian law enforcement doesn't typically provide." I took a sip of my coffee, buying time to organize my thoughts. When I'm protecting embassy personnel in conflict zones or conducting security assessments in politically unstable regions, military training becomes essential. Dad leaned forward with the expression he wore during important business meetings. "What kind of training are we talking about?" "Combat medicine, tactical driving, threat assessment, close protection procedures, emergency evacuation protocols." I listed them matter-of-factly, watching my parents' faces as they processed what each item implied. Languages, cultural briefings, weapons qualification, diplomatic immunity laws, counter-surveillance techniques. "Weapons?" Mom's voice went up half an octave. "I'm qualified on multiple weapon systems and carry when the security situation requires it." I saw her face pale and quickly added, But most of my work involves coordination and assessment rather than direct confrontation. The goal is to prevent dangerous situations, not respond to them after they develop. Most of your work, Dad repeated, focusing on the qualifier. What about the rest? I was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out how much truth they could handle. Sometimes prevention isn't possible. Sometimes American personnel find themselves in immediate danger and need evacuation or protection, while diplomatic solutions are being negotiated. The coffee shop continued its afternoon rhythm around us, customers ordering complicated drinks and settling into laptops or conversations. But at our corner table, the atmosphere felt charged with revelations that were reshaping years of family dinners where I'd given vague answers about work trips and conference attendance. The phone call last month, Mom said suddenly, when you sounded exhausted and said you'd been traveling for 2 weeks but couldn't say where. I was in Montenegro, conducting a security assessment for the embassy in Podgorica. Political tensions were escalating, and the State Department needed to know whether American staff should be relocated or if additional security measures would be sufficient. I met her eyes steadily. The assessment took longer than expected because the situation kept changing. Dangerous? Dad asked. Potentially. There had been threats against Western diplomatic personnel, and local law enforcement capabilities were limited. I spent most of the time coordinating with embassy security and meeting with local officials to assess the credibility of various threats. And you couldn't tell us this because operational security requires that assignment details remain classified until the situation is resolved and personnel are safe. Even now, I can only discuss general information because the political situation in the region remains sensitive. My mother absorbed this information with the expression she wore when calculating risks and probabilities. After 30 years of marriage to a man who traveled for business, she developed finely tuned instincts for when situations were routine versus genuinely concerning. How often do you go to places like that? She asked. 4 or 5 times a year, depending on global situations and State Department priorities. Sometimes it's routine assessment work in stable countries. Sometimes it's emergency response in crisis situations. I rotated my coffee cup between my hands, choosing my words carefully. The Balkans, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa generate most of the assignments that require specialized security expertise. Africa? Dad's voice carried new concern. You've never mentioned Africa. 6 months ago, I spent 3 weeks in Chad, helping coordinate the evacuation of American aid workers when fighting between government forces and rebel groups moved too close to their operational area. I watched both parents process this information, seeing the wheels turning as they began to understand the scope of what I'd been doing while telling them I was attending training conferences. The situation resolved peacefully, but it required careful coordination with multiple groups to ensure safe passage out of the region. The coffee shop barista called out someone's complicated order, breaking the silence that had settled over our table. My parents sat with their drinks growing cold, mentally rewriting 3 years of phone conversations and visit schedules through the lens of what they were learning about my actual work. The times you said you couldn't talk long because you were in briefings, Mom said slowly. You were really in briefings about security threats, political developments, evacuation procedures, personnel protection protocols. I took another sip of coffee, watching them adjust to this new reality. The briefings part was true. I just couldn't explain what we were being briefed about. And when you said you were working late because of project deadlines, I was often working late, but on threat assessments, intelligence reports, security recommendations, and coordination with embassy staff in different time zones. I looked at both of them, seeing the mixture of pride and worry that was becoming familiar. The late nights were real. The project descriptions were necessarily vague. Dad set down his coffee cup with the decisive gesture he used when making important business decisions. I need to understand something. When you're in these dangerous places, what kind of support do you have? Are you working alone, or are there teams, backup, people who know where you are? I'm never working completely alone. Even on solo assessment assignments, I'm in regular contact with embassy security, regional supervisors, and State Department operations centers. For high-risk situations, we work in teams with other DSS agents, sometimes coordinating with military personnel or local security forces. But you said you were in Chad for 3 weeks helping with evacuations. as part of a team that included other DSS agents, military advisors, and State Department personnel. My specific role was coordinating with local authorities and assessing safe routes for evacuating American civilians. I leaned forward, trying to convey the difference between calculated professional risk and reckless endangerment. We don't send people into dangerous situations without proper support and planning. The risks are real, but they're managed risks. Managed risks, Mom repeated, with the tone she reserved for euphemisms that didn't fully explain the reality they were masking. Yes, like a police officer responding to a domestic violence call, or a firefighter entering a burning building, or a surgeon operating on a critical patient. Dangerous, but with training, protocols, equipment, and support systems designed to maximize the chances of successful outcomes. The comparison seemed to help both parents contextualize what I was describing. Dad had served briefly in the National Guard during his 20s, and Mom had worked as an emergency room nurse before I was born. They understood professional risk management in ways that made my explanations more accessible. The training you mentioned, Dad said, how extensive is it really? Initial DSS training is 6 months of intensive coursework and practical exercises. Combat medicine, tactical driving, firearms qualification, diplomatic law, cultural awareness, threat assessment, emergency communications, close protection procedures. I counted them off on my fingers, watching his expression grow more serious with each item. Then ongoing training throughout your career as situations and technologies change. 6 months, Mom said faintly. Where? Federal law enforcement training centers, some specialized facilities that I can't identify specifically, and partner training with military units for certain skill sets. I saw her calculating timeline and added, remember when I said I was doing extended orientation training right after I got hired? That was the 6-month program. Extended orientation, Dad repeated, with the tone that meant he was remembering specific conversations. You said it was comprehensive, but routine. It was comprehensive. The routine part was creative interpretation. My phone buzzed with an incoming message, and I glanced at the screen automatically. A text from my supervisor about a briefing scheduled for tomorrow morning regarding developing situations in 2 different countries. Nothing urgent, but a reminder that even during family coffee conversations, the work continued in the background. Work? Mom asked, noticing my phone check. Schedule update for tomorrow. Nothing urgent. I turned the phone face down on the table. One of the challenges of this job is that international situations don't respect normal business hours or weekend plans. How often does work interrupt personal time? More than I'd like, less than it could. Emergency situations require immediate response, but most of the work follows predictable schedules. I thought about the various times I'd had to cut short family visits or cancel plans because of developing crises. Maybe once or twice a month, something comes up that requires immediate attention. Like what happened at the post office today, Dad observed. You needed to send something urgently to Prague. Exactly. Security assessments often have tight deadlines because personnel decisions depend on current information. The Prague embassy needed updated threat analysis to determine whether additional security measures were necessary for upcoming diplomatic meetings. Diplomatic meetings, Mom said, testing the phrase like she was learning new vocabulary. The kind you might provide security for? Possibly. Depends on the threat level and the nature of the meetings. Sometimes diplomatic security involves standing in the background making sure everything proceeds smoothly. Sometimes it involves more active threat mitigation. The afternoon light slanting through the coffee shop windows had shifted, marking the passage of time as we worked through years of carefully edited explanations and sanitized job descriptions. Other customers had come and gone, laptops had closed, and conversations had ended, but we remained at our corner table working through the implications of my revealed credentials. I have a confession, Dad said suddenly. There were times when I wondered if you were telling us everything about your job. What made you wonder? Little things. The way you talked about travel. Always vague about locations and purposes. Phone calls that got cut short with explanations about urgent meetings. The fact that you seemed to know things about international situations that hadn't been reported in regular news yet. He paused, studying my face. And you seemed different after you started this job. More alert. More aware of your surroundings. more careful about personal security in ways that didn't make sense for someone who worked in cultural exchange programs. Different how? The way you park your car now, always backing into spaces so you can see the area and exit quickly. How you sit in restaurants, always with a view of entrances and exits. The fact that you carry a different phone when you travel, one you never let out of your sight. He enumerated observations I hadn't realized he'd been making. None of it made sense for someone who organized student exchange programs. But it makes perfect sense for someone who does security work in potentially dangerous environments. Mom nodded agreement. And the languages. You always said you were taking language classes for professional development, but you became fluent in Serbian and Arabic faster than seemed possible for casual study. Those weren't casual study programs, I admitted. Language training for diplomatic security is intensive, because communicating with local authorities and understanding regional dialects can be critical for personnel safety. Serbian and Arabic, Dad repeated. That covers a lot of potential assignment locations. Most of the Balkans and much of the Middle East and North Africa, yes. The State Department prioritizes language capabilities that provide maximum coverage for regional assignments. Have you used both languages professionally? Multiple times. Language skills are often what determines which agent gets assigned to specific situations. I thought about conversations conducted in Serbian with local police commanders, Arabic discussions with security officials about threat assessments, and briefings delivered in both languages to American personnel who needed to understand regional security dynamics. When you're coordinating evacuation routes or assessing local security capabilities, being able to communicate directly with key personnel can mean the difference between successful operations and dangerous misunderstandings. The responsibility, Mom said quietly. Other people's safety depending on your assessments and decisions. Yes, that's probably the most challenging aspect of the job. Knowing that embassy staff, aid workers, diplomatic personnel, and American civilians in crisis situations are depending on accurate threat analysis and effective security coordination. I met her eyes. It's why the training is so extensive, and why we take operational security so seriously, and why you couldn't tell us what you were really doing. Partly, but also because I wanted to protect you from worrying about situations you couldn't influence or control. When I'm conducting security assessments in politically unstable regions, there's nothing you can do to help. And knowing the details would just cause stress without providing any useful information. Dad leaned back in his chair with the expression he wore when processing complex information. But now we know. Now you know the general nature of what I do, yes. Specific assignments and operational details will still need to remain classified, but you understand the scope and purpose of the work. Will we worry more? Mom asked directly. Probably, but you'll also understand why certain phone calls have to be brief, why travel schedules change unexpectedly, and why I sometimes can't discuss where I've been or what I've been working on. I looked at both of them, hoping they could find a balance between concern and acceptance. The work is important, and I'm good at it, and I'm as safe as anyone can be in situations that inherently involve some level of risk. As safe as anyone can be, Mom repeated with a tone that suggested she was already beginning to worry about future phone calls and travel notifications. The same way a surgeon is as safe as anyone can be when performing complex operations, or a police officer is as safe as anyone can be when responding to emergency calls. Professional risk management, extensive training, proper equipment, and support systems. The barista began cleaning equipment behind the counter, preparing for the late afternoon shift change. Our coffee cups were long empty, but none of us seemed ready to leave the conversation that was redefining 3 years of family interactions. What happens now? Dad asked. Now that we know what your job actually involves, we have more honest conversations about work, with the understanding that some details have to remain classified for security reasons. You worry appropriately, but not excessively. I continue doing work that's important and challenging, and you both understand why my schedule and availability can be unpredictable. And the next time you need to send diplomatic correspondence from the post office, Mom said with a slight smile, Douglas will be ready for you. Douglas will probably tell that story for years, I laughed. The day a young woman came in with her parents and turned out to be a federal officer with diplomatic credentials. Will other people at the post office treat you differently now? Probably. Word gets around in organizations, especially when someone processes their first diplomatic pouch, but it doesn't matter much since I rarely use civilian postal services for official correspondence. Dad checked his watch, a gesture that usually signaled the end of important conversations. We should probably head home soon, but I have one more question. Ask away. Are you happy doing this work? Not just professionally satisfied, but genuinely happy with the career you've chosen? The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so direct, and partly because the answer required me to examine aspects of my job that I rarely discussed with anyone. Yes, I'm happy doing this work. It's challenging in ways that keep me engaged, important in ways that give meaning to the difficulties, and it utilizes skills and interests that I've developed over years of education and training. Even with the risks and the secrecy and the unpredictable schedule, those are costs of doing work that matters. Every job has costs, and most jobs don't have the benefit of protecting American personnel overseas or contributing to diplomatic solutions in complex international situations. I paused, trying to articulate something I'd never fully explained to anyone. When embassy staff can do their jobs safely because I've conducted thorough security assessments, or when American civilians are evacuated successfully from crisis situations because of coordinated protection efforts, the costs feel worthwhile. And you want to continue doing this work? For the foreseeable future, yes. There are opportunities for advancement within the Diplomatic Security Service, possibilities for specialized training, and assignments that would provide even greater responsibilities and challenges. Mom gathered her purse with the decisive movement that usually ended family meetings. Then, we support your career choice, and we'll learn to manage our concerns about the risks involved. And we'll stop asking vague questions about your work trips, Dad added, since we now understand why the answers were necessarily vague. You can ask questions. I'll answer what I can, and explain when I can't provide specific information. I stood up, shouldering my jacket and preparing to return to a world where my parents finally understood what I actually did for a living. It'll be easier for all of us now that the basic framework is clear. Walking out of the coffee shop into the late afternoon sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of maintaining cover stories and sanitized explanations had been replaced by the relief of honest communication within appropriate security boundaries. My parents would worry more about specific dangers, but they'd worry less about unknown risks and undefined concerns. The drive home gave me time to think about how the day had unfolded, starting with a routine trip to mail official correspondence and ending with a complete revelation of my professional identity. Douglas, the postal clerk, had inadvertently forced a conversation that had been years in the making, simply by refusing to believe that someone my age could legitimately need diplomatic courier services. His assumptions about my capabilities and credentials had created a situation where demonstration became necessary, and demonstration had led to family revelations that changed everything about how my parents understood my career and my life. But more importantly, the incident had reminded me that respect often comes through evidence rather than explanation, that credentials carry weight when properly presented, and that sometimes the people who love us need to see our professional competence demonstrated by others before they can fully appreciate what we do. Tomorrow would bring new briefings, new assessments, and possibly new assignments that would take me to places my parents now understood might be dangerous. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I could call them from wherever I was and give them honest answers about my work, within the bounds of operational security requirements. Douglas, the postal clerk, would probably never know that his condescending attitude toward a young woman mailing official correspondence had triggered a family conversation that resolved years of careful deception and necessary secrecy. But his transformation from dismissive skeptic to respectful federal employee had provided my parents with a demonstration of the professional respect that my credentials commanded in official settings. Sometimes the most important revelations happen in the most ordinary places, triggered by the most routine interactions, and witnessed by people who never understand the significance of what they've observed. The phone rang at 6:30 the next morning, pulling me from sleep with the particular urgency that work calls always carried. The caller ID showed my supervisor's number, which meant something significant was developing somewhere in the world that required immediate attention from personnel with specific skill sets and security clearances. "Thompson," I answered. already mentally preparing for rapid deployment instructions or emergency briefing requirements. Sarah, we've got a developing situation in Albania that needs immediate assessment. Can you be in Washington by noon for briefing? Agent Martinez's voice carried the controlled tension that meant American personnel were potentially at risk and decisions needed to be made quickly. Of course. Embassy staff or civilian contractors? Both. Political demonstrations in Tirana have turned violent, and there are reports of anti-American sentiment escalating beyond typical protest activity. The ambassador needs current threat assessment and recommendations for personnel security measures. I was already out of bed, mentally cataloging what needed to be packed for potential extended deployment to a politically unstable region. How long should I plan for? Initial assessment suggests 7 to 10 days, but that could extend depending on how the situation develops. Pack for 2 weeks to be safe. Understood. I'll be at headquarters by 11:30. After ending the call, I sat on the edge of my bed for a moment, processing the implications of this assignment coming so soon after yesterday's revelation to my parents. For 3 years, calls like this had been explained as emergency training sessions or urgent project meetings. Now, for the first time, I could tell them the truth about where I was going and why, within the bounds of operational security requirements. The irony wasn't lost on me that my first honest conversation about work deployment would involve traveling to a country experiencing civil unrest and potential threats to American personnel. My parents had just learned to worry appropriately about my career, and now they'd have a specific situation to worry about rather than vague concerns about unknown dangers. I dialed my mother's number while pulling clothes from my closet, knowing she'd be awake and probably drinking her first cup of coffee while reading morning news on her tablet. "Honey, this is early, even for you." Work call. "I need to travel today for an assignment, and I wanted to let you know directly rather than leaving a message later." There was a pause as she processed the significance of receiving this information up front instead of after the fact. "Where are you going?" "Albania." "There's political unrest in the capital, and the embassy needs current security assessment to determine appropriate protection measures for American personnel." "Political unrest," she repeated, with the tone that meant she was already accessing news websites to research the situation. How serious? Serious enough to require on-site assessment, but not serious enough to have already triggered evacuation procedures. The situation is developing, and the State Department needs current intelligence to make informed decisions about personnel safety. "How long will you be gone?" "Probably 7 to 10 days, possibly longer depending on how events unfold." I pulled tactical clothing from my closet, the kind of professional attire that looked civilian but incorporated protection features and concealed carry capabilities. "I'll have communication access and will update you when I can, with the understanding that operational details have to remain classified." "Will you be safe?" The question carried weight now that she understood what my safety protocols actually involved. "I'll have appropriate security measures, embassy support, and coordination with local authorities." The same professional risk management we discussed yesterday. "And if the situation gets worse while you're there?" "Then evacuation procedures go into effect and American personnel, including assessment teams, get relocated to safer areas until the situation stabilizes." I zipped my tactical bag, checking that emergency communication equipment was properly secured. The State Department doesn't leave people in dangerous situations without support and exit strategies. "Should I tell your father?" "Yes, and let him know that this is exactly the kind of assignment we discussed yesterday. Security assessment in a politically unstable region, coordinating with embassy staff, working with local authorities to evaluate threat levels and recommend protection measures. He'll want to follow news coverage of the situation." "That's fine, but remember that news reports often don't reflect the complete picture of what's happening on the ground. My assessments will be based on direct observation and intelligence that doesn't make it into public reporting." After ending the call with my mother, I continued packing while mentally reviewing what I knew about current political dynamics in Albania. Anti-government demonstrations had been escalating for weeks, driven by economic concerns and corruption allegations. The addition of anti-American rhetoric to the protests suggested either opportunistic political positioning or coordination with groups that had broader geopolitical objectives beyond domestic policy changes. Either way, American embassy staff and civilian contractors in Tirana needed current threat assessment to determine whether normal security measures were sufficient or whether enhanced protection protocols were necessary. That determination required on-site evaluation by personnel with experience in political risk analysis and threat mitigation. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number which immediately triggered the security awareness training that had become second nature over 3 years of assignments. Unknown contacts during deployment preparation could indicate anything from misdirected civilian messages to targeted intelligence gathering by hostile groups monitoring American personnel movements. The message read, "Major Thompson, this is Patricia Martinez from the Postal Service. I wanted to follow up on yesterday's diplomatic correspondence. Please contact me at your earliest convenience regarding postal procedures." I stared at the message for several seconds, trying to process why a postal supervisor would be contacting me directly about routine diplomatic mail that had already been processed and delivered. The timing, coming during deployment preparation for an assignment involving potential threats to American personnel, triggered every security protocol I'd been trained to follow. I called my supervisor immediately. "Martinez here. Agent Martinez, this is Thompson. I just received a text message from someone claiming to be a postal supervisor, asking me to contact them about yesterday's diplomatic correspondence. Given the timing with today's deployment, I'm treating this as a potential security concern." Describe the message exactly. I read the text verbatim, including the name Patricia Martinez and the request for contact regarding postal procedures. "That's interesting timing," my supervisor agreed. "Could be legitimate follow-up. Could be intelligence probing, could be someone fishing for information about diplomatic communication methods. How did they get your personal number?" "Unknown. I didn't provide personal contact information during yesterday's postal visit." "Okay, don't respond to the message. We'll have our counterintelligence people check it out while you're in Albania. If it's legitimate postal business, they can verify that through official channels. If it's something else, we need to know about it before it becomes a larger security issue." "Understood. And Thompson? Good security awareness. Always better to report potential concerns than ignore them and discover later that they were significant." After ending the call, I finished packing with heightened awareness of the various ways that routine interactions could become security issues when you worked in positions that attracted attention from groups with hostile intentions toward American interests. The postal incident yesterday had involved credentials verification and official correspondence processing, both of which could have been observed by people with intelligence collection objectives. The drive to Washington gave me time to think about how yesterday's revelation to my parents was already changing the way I approached my work. For 3 years, operational security had been about protecting classified information and maintaining cover stories that kept family members from worrying about situations they couldn't influence. Now, operational security included protecting family members who knew enough about my work to be potential targets for intelligence gathering, or leverage operations. The thought was unsettling but not surprising. Personnel with security clearances and access to sensitive information were always potential targets, and family members were often the most vulnerable avenue for exploitation. The difference was that my parents now knew enough about my actual work to understand why certain security measures were necessary, rather than viewing them as paranoid overreaction to imaginary threats. Headquarters buzzed with controlled urgency that characterized crisis response operations. Personnel moved through corridors with purposeful efficiency, carrying briefing folders and secure communication devices while discussing logistical arrangements and intelligence updates. The atmosphere was professional and focused, but charged with awareness that American personnel in a foreign country might be facing genuine danger. Agent Martinez met me at the secure briefing room with a folder containing classified intelligence reports, threat assessments, and background information on current political dynamics in Albania. The briefing would cover everything I needed to know about the situation on the ground, the specific concerns that had triggered this assignment, and the coordination requirements with embassy staff and local authorities. "Before we begin," Martinez said, closing the briefing room door and activating security protocols that prevented electronic surveillance, "tell me about this postal supervisor contact. Any additional thoughts about how they might have obtained your personal number?" "I've been thinking about that. The only people who witnessed the credential verification yesterday were postal employees, customers in line, and my parents. My parents wouldn't have shared contact information, which means either postal employees have access to personnel databases they shouldn't be accessing, or someone else observed the interaction and obtained my information through other means. Or the contact is legitimate and the postal supervisor obtained your number through official channels for follow-up on diplomatic correspondence procedures. Possible, but the timing raises red flags. Why contact me directly instead of going through State Department protocols for diplomatic communication inquiries? Exactly the right question. We'll investigate while you're deployed. If it's innocent, no harm done. If it's not innocent, we need to understand the scope and objectives of whoever is making inquiries about your credentials and communication methods. The briefing that followed was comprehensive and sobering. Political demonstrations in Tirana had evolved beyond typical protest activity to include organized violence against government buildings, infrastructure targets, and symbols of Western influence. American embassy staff had reported increased surveillance, suspicious activity near embassy facilities, and intelligence suggesting that anti-American groups were using the political unrest as cover for activities that pose direct threats to American personnel. Your assessment mission, Martinez explained, is to evaluate current threat levels, determine whether existing security measures are adequate, and provide recommendations for personnel protection or evacuation if the situation continues to deteriorate. Timeline for recommendations? 72 hours for initial assessment, with daily updates as the situation develops. The ambassador needs actionable intelligence to make decisions about embassy operations and personnel safety. Local authority cooperation? Mixed. Some Albanian security forces are reliable partners. Others have been compromised by political pressure or outright corruption. You'll need to assess which local contacts can be trusted and which represent potential security risks. Support team? You'll coordinate with embassy security staff and have backup from regional DSS agents if the situation requires additional personnel. Communication protocols include emergency extraction procedures if threats escalate beyond manageable levels. The flight to Albania gave me 6 hours to review intelligence files, study maps of Tirana and surrounding areas, and prepare for deployment in a country experiencing political upheaval that directly threatened American interests. The assignment represented exactly the kind of work I'd tried to explain to my parents yesterday, but with the added complexity of knowing they would be following news coverage and worrying about specific dangers instead of vague concerns about unknown risks. I drafted a careful email to send once I arrived in country, providing general information about my location and assignment status without revealing operational details that needed to remain classified. The message would let them know I'd arrived safely and was beginning work, with the understanding that communication might be limited during the assessment period. Landing in Tirana felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. The airport buzzed with unusual security activity, armed guards at checkpoints, and the general tension that characterized countries experiencing civil unrest. Embassy personnel met me at customs with diplomatic credentials that expedited processing, but I could see the heightened alert status in their movements and communications. Major Thompson? I'm Agent Collins, Embassy Security. Welcome to Albania. Current status? Deteriorating. 3 more incidents of violence against Western targets since yesterday, including an attack on a European Union office that resulted in significant property damage. The ambassador wants your assessment before making decisions about personnel reduction or enhanced security protocols. The drive through Tirana provided immediate evidence of the political instability that had triggered my deployment. Burned vehicles, broken storefronts, graffiti targeting government officials and Western institutions, and the heavy presence of security forces that suggested authorities were struggling to maintain control of the situation. How are embassy staff handling the stress? I asked, observing the security measures that Collins was implementing during our movement through the city. Professional but concerned. Most have experience with political unrest, but the targeting of Western facilities is new and troubling. They need to know whether they can continue normal operations or whether we're looking at evacuation scenarios. American civilians in country? About 40, mostly business contractors and aid workers. They're maintaining normal activities but watching the situation closely. Some have asked about evacuation recommendations. The embassy compound reflected the heightened security status, with additional barriers, increased guard presence, and communication equipment that suggested preparation for emergency operations. Staff moved with the purposeful efficiency of people executing well-rehearsed security protocols while hoping they wouldn't need to implement more extreme measures. Ambassador Wilson met me in the secure conference room with a briefing folder containing the latest intelligence reports and specific concerns that had prompted the assessment request. Her expression carried the weight of responsibility for American personnel safety in an increasingly dangerous environment. Major Thompson, thank you for responding so quickly. We need current threat analysis and recommendations for personnel security within 48 hours. Understood. What specific indicators have prompted immediate concern? Intelligence suggests that anti-American groups are using the political demonstrations as cover for operations targeting embassy facilities and American personnel. We've had increased surveillance, suspicious reconnaissance activity, and credible reports of planned attacks against Western interests. Local authority cooperation? Inconsistent. Some police commanders are reliable partners. Others have been influenced by political pressure to limit cooperation with American security operations. You'll need to assess which relationships we can depend on and which represent potential intelligence compromises. The next 2 hours involve detailed briefings on current threat indicators, political dynamics affecting American interests, and specific security concerns that needed immediate evaluation. The information painted a picture of a country in political crisis where American personnel faced genuine dangers that required professional risk assessment and mitigation strategies. As evening approached, I established secure communications with headquarters and sent carefully worded updates to my family, letting them know I'd arrived safely and begun work without revealing operational details that needed to remain classified. For the first time in 3 years, I could provide honest information about my location and general assignment purpose while maintaining appropriate security boundaries. The email to my parents read, "Arrived safely in Tirana and beginning security assessment work with embassy staff. Situation is politically unstable but manageable with proper security measures. Communication may be limited during assessment period, but will update when possible. Love you both." It felt liberating to send honest information instead of fabricated cover stories about training conferences or project meetings. My parents would worry about specific dangers in Albania, but they'd worry based on accurate information rather than vague anxieties about unknown risks and undefined threats. The first night in Tirana involved reviewing intelligence reports, coordinating with embassy security staff, and preparing for direct observation of political demonstrations and security conditions throughout the city. The work represented exactly what I'd tried to explain to my parents during our coffee shop conversation, but with the immediate urgency of American personnel facing potential threats in a foreign country experiencing civil unrest. Tomorrow would bring direct assessment of threat indicators, meetings with local security officials, and evaluation of protection measures for American staff and civilians. The information I gathered would directly influence decisions about personnel safety and embassy operations, which meant the quality of my analysis could affect the security of dozens of Americans living and working in Albania. The responsibility was significant but familiar, the natural extension of training and experience gained over 3 years of assignments in politically unstable regions. The difference was that my family now understood the scope and importance of this work, even if they couldn't know the specific details of what I was observing and reporting. As I settled into the secure accommodation arranged by embassy staff, I reflected on how the postal office incident had triggered a cascade of changes in family relationships and personal security awareness. Douglas, the postal clerk's dismissive attitude, had forced a revelation that transformed 3 years of carefully maintained cover stories into honest communication within appropriate security boundaries. But more significantly, the incident had reminded me that professional competence often requires demonstration rather than explanation, that respect comes through evidence rather than assertion, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most ordinary places, triggered by the most routine interactions. The text message from the postal supervisor remained unanswered and under investigation, a potential security concern that illustrated how routine interactions could become intelligence-gathering opportunities when you worked in positions that attracted attention from groups with hostile intentions toward American interests. The work in Albania would require all the skills and experience I'd developed over 3 years of diplomatic security assignments, but it would unfold with the knowledge that my family finally understood what I actually did for a living and why certain security measures were necessary for protecting both operational information and personnel safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new assessments, and new decisions that affected the safety of American personnel in a foreign country experiencing political upheaval. But tonight, for the first time in my career, I could face those challenges with the support of family members who understood the importance and difficulty of the work, even if they couldn't know the specific details of how it was accomplished. The revelation at the post office had changed everything about how I approached my career and my family relationships, and the changes were still unfolding in ways I was only beginning to understand. The morning of my 3rd day in Tirana brought the kind of intelligence that changes everything about an assessment mission. Agent Collins approached my temporary workspace in the embassy with a controlled urgency that meant American personnel were facing immediate danger rather than potential future threats. Major Thompson, we've intercepted communications indicating a coordinated attack planned against the embassy compound within the next 24 hours. The ambassador needs your immediate recommendations for personnel protection. I set aside the threat analysis reports I'd been compiling and focused on the operational reality that my assessment had suddenly shifted from evaluation to crisis response. What kind of attack are we looking at? Vehicle-borne explosive device, coordinated with small arms assault on embassy perimeter defenses. Intelligence suggests the operation involves both local criminal elements and organized anti-American groups, using the political demonstrations as cover. Credibility level? High. Multiple independent sources corroborating details and surveillance that confirms reconnaissance activity consistent with attack planning. Cohen's handed me a classified intelligence summary that outlines specific threat indicators and potential timing for the planned assault. The ambassador is considering immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel. I reviewed the intelligence summary while mentally calculating protection options and evacuation logistics for American staff and civilians throughout Tirana. The situation had escalated beyond routine security assessment to active threat mitigation requiring immediate decisions that would affect dozens of lives. Timeline for personnel evacuation? 6 hours for embassy staff, 12 hours for American civilians if we implement emergency protocols. The question is whether we're overreacting to intelligence that might be inaccurate, or whether we're facing genuine imminent danger that requires immediate action. That's exactly why I'm here, I replied, already planning direct observation of threat indicators and coordination with local security forces to verify intelligence accuracy. I need to assess the credibility of these reports and evaluate whether current security measures can manage the threat or whether evacuation is necessary. The next 4 hours involved intensive fieldwork that represented diplomatic security at its most critical. I coordinated with reliable local police commanders to verify intelligence sources, conducted surveillance of potential attack staging areas, and evaluated embassy perimeter defenses against the specific threat scenarios outlined in the intercepted communications. The work required every skill I'd developed over 3 years of assignments in politically unstable regions. Threat assessment based on incomplete information, coordination with foreign security forces of questionable reliability, and evaluation of protection measures under time pressure that left no margin for error. By early afternoon, I had enough information to provide the ambassador with actionable recommendations. The intelligence was credible, the threat was imminent, and current security measures were insufficient to protect American personnel against a coordinated assault involving explosives and automatic weapons. Ambassador Wilson, I reported in the secure conference room. I recommend immediate implementation of emergency evacuation procedures for all non-essential personnel, enhanced security protocols for essential staff who remain, and coordination with Albanian authorities for additional protection around embassy facilities. How confident are you in this assessment? High confidence based on multiple verified intelligence sources, direct observation of threat indicators, and evaluation of current security capabilities against the specific attack scenarios we're facing. I handed her my written assessment with detailed recommendations and supporting evidence. The risk of casualties from inaction significantly outweighs the costs and diplomatic complications of emergency evacuation. Essential personnel requirements? Minimum staffing to maintain diplomatic operations and communication with Washington, all with enhanced personal security details and emergency extraction capabilities if the situation deteriorates further. Timeline for implementation? Evacuation flights can begin within 2 hours, with most non-essential personnel out of country by tomorrow morning. Enhanced security measures for remaining staff can be implemented immediately. The ambassador studied my assessment with the expression of someone weighing decisions that would affect careers, diplomatic relationships, and potentially human lives. After several minutes of careful review, she looked up with the resolve that characterized senior State Department officials facing crisis situations. Implement your recommendations immediately. Begin evacuation procedures for non-essential personnel and enhance security protocols for staff who remain. The next 18 hours represented diplomatic security operations at their most intensive, coordinating evacuation flights for American personnel, implementing enhanced protection measures for embassy staff, working with local authorities to establish security perimeters around American facilities, and maintaining communication with Washington as the situation developed. The planned attack materialized exactly as intelligence reports had predicted, but coordinated security measures and reduced personnel presence meant that what could have been a catastrophic assault on American diplomatic facilities became a failed operation against enhanced defenses, protecting minimal essential staff. No American personnel were injured. Embassy operations continued with reduced capacity but maintained capability. The attackers were captured or dispersed by Albanian security forces working in coordination with embassy protection teams. My assessment had been accurate, my recommendations had been implemented effectively, and American personnel had been protected through professional risk management and coordinated security response. The successful threat mitigation represented exactly the kind of work I'd tried to explain to my parents during our coffee shop conversation, but with immediate life-and-death consequences that illustrated why diplomatic security training was so extensive and why operational security requirements were so strict. As the immediate crisis subsided and evacuation procedures were reversed, I prepared the comprehensive after-action report that would document lessons learned and improve future security protocols. The report would be classified and distributed to personnel with appropriate clearances, but the successful protection of American lives in a foreign crisis situation represented the kind of achievement that made the costs and challenges of diplomatic security work worthwhile. The flight home gave me time to process what had happened in Albania and how it connected to the revelation that had begun with a condescending postal clerk questioning my credentials. The successful assessment and threat mitigation had required every aspect of the training and experience I'd developed over 3 years of assignments, but it had unfolded with the knowledge that my family finally understood the importance and difficulty of what I did for a living. I drafted a careful message to my parents, providing general information about successful completion of my assignment without revealing operational details that needed to remain classified. Albania assignment completed successfully. All American personnel safe and accounted for. Returning home tomorrow. Will call when I land. For the first time in my career, I could provide honest updates about mission completion and personnel safety, instead of fabricated explanations about concluded training conferences or finished project work. The relief of honest communication within appropriate security boundaries had become one of the unexpected benefits of the Postal Office revelation. Landing at Washington Dulles felt like returning from a different world, one where American lives had depended on accurate threat assessment and coordinated security response. The successful mission would be documented in classified reports and remembered by the personnel whose safety I'd helped protect. But it wouldn't generate headlines or public recognition, because diplomatic security worked best when it prevented crises rather than responding to them after they developed. Agent Martinez met me at headquarters for immediate debriefing on the Albania assessment and mission outcomes. The successful threat mitigation would be analyzed for lessons learned and incorporated into future training programs, but first I needed to provide detailed accounts of intelligence evaluation, coordination challenges, and security measures that had proven effective. Outstanding work, Thompson. Your assessment probably saved lives, and your recommendations were implemented flawlessly under extreme time pressure. Thank you. It represented exactly the kind of situation that diplomatic security training prepares us for, but experiencing it firsthand reinforced why the preparation is so intensive. Speaking of preparation, we resolved the postal supervisor contact while you were deployed. Turned out to be legitimate follow-up about processing procedures for diplomatic correspondence. She'd obtained your contact information through official channels and wanted to ensure her staff understood proper protocols for future situations. So no security concern? No security concern, just conscientious follow-up by a postal supervisor who wanted to make sure she was prepared to handle diplomatic mail correctly after processing her first diplomatic pouch. The resolution felt appropriate given how the entire sequence of events had started with Douglas, the postal clerk, questioning whether I had legitimate credentials for diplomatic correspondence. His initial skepticism had triggered revelations that transformed my family relationships, and now Patricia Martinez's professional follow-up was closing the loop on procedural improvements that would benefit future diplomatic communication. One additional note, Martinez continued. The successful Albania assessment, combined with your performance record and security clearance level, qualifies you for consideration for senior agent positions with expanded responsibilities and leadership roles. What kind of expanded responsibilities? Training new agents, coordinating multi-country assessments, leading response teams for complex crisis situations. Positions that would utilize your field experience and analytical skills while providing career advancement opportunities. The prospect of expanded responsibilities appealed to me, particularly after experiencing the satisfaction of successful threat mitigation in Albania. Leading teams of agents, coordinating regional security assessments, and training personnel for assignments in politically unstable regions would represent natural career progression within the diplomatic security service. I'm interested in learning more about those opportunities. We'll discuss specifics after you've had time to process the Albania mission and consider your long-term career objectives within DSS. The drive home gave me time to think about how much had changed since the postal office incident had forced honest conversations with my parents about my actual work. The successful Albania assignment had validated their new understanding of what diplomatic security involved, but it had also demonstrated why certain aspects of the work needed to remain classified even within family relationships. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway, showing my mother's number and the eager anticipation I'd learned to recognize in her voice when I returned from assignments. "You're home?" "Just pulled in. Albania assignment completed successfully, all personnel safe, mission objectives accomplished." We followed news coverage of the political situation. It looked very serious. It was serious, which is why the State Department sent assessment teams to evaluate threats and coordinate protection measures for American personnel. I unlocked my front door, grateful to be back in familiar surroundings after a week of crisis response in a foreign country. The situation was managed effectively through professional security protocols and coordination with local authorities. "And you're safe and uninjured?" "Completely safe and uninjured." The work involved assessment and coordination rather than direct confrontation, and all American personnel were protected through appropriate security measures. "Your father wants to take you to dinner tomorrow night to hear about your assignment, understanding that you can't discuss operational details." "That sounds perfect. I can explain general aspects of diplomatic security work and how successful threat assessment protected American personnel without revealing classified information about specific operations." The dinner conversation that followed represented everything that had changed about family communication since the postal office revelation. My parents asked informed questions about diplomatic security work, expressed appropriate concern about assignment risks, and demonstrated understanding of why certain details needed to remain classified for operational security reasons. "The Albania assignment," my father said over dessert, "represented exactly the kind of work you tried to explain to us during our coffee shop conversation." "Exactly. Security assessment in a politically unstable region, coordination with embassy staff and local authorities, evaluation of threat levels, and recommendations for personnel protection measures. And the successful outcome means American personnel remained safe because of your assessment and recommendations." American personnel remained safe because of coordinated security efforts that included my assessment, embassy security measures, local authority cooperation, and State Department crisis response protocols. I looked at both parents, seeing their pride and understanding. Individual contribution was important, but successful diplomatic security always involves team coordination and institutional support. "Will you accept the senior agent positions that Agent Martinez mentioned?" I paused, considering career advancement opportunities within the context of family relationships that had been fundamentally changed by honest communication about my professional responsibilities. I'm seriously considering those opportunities. Senior positions would involve training new agents, coordinating complex assessments, and leading response teams for crisis situations. Work that would utilize field experience while providing career advancement and expanded responsibilities. More dangerous assignments? Different kinds of responsibilities, some involving management and training rather than direct field work. But yes, probably continued assignments in regions where diplomatic security expertise is needed. "Then we support your career advancement," my mother said with a tone that meant family decisions had been made and would be supported regardless of personal concerns about associated risks. The conversation represented everything I'd hoped for during 3 years of carefully maintained cover stories and sanitized explanations. Family members who understood the importance and difficulty of diplomatic security work expressed appropriate pride in professional achievements and accepted necessary boundaries around classified information. 6 months later, when I accepted promotion to senior agent status with responsibilities for training new personnel and coordinating regional security assessments, my parents attended the promotion ceremony with understanding of what the advancement represented and pride in professional achievements they could finally comprehend. Douglas, the postal clerk, probably never understood that his condescending attitude toward a young woman mailing official correspondence had triggered family revelations that fundamentally changed relationships and career perspectives. But his transformation from dismissive skeptic to respectful federal employee had provided the catalyst for honest communication that made everything else possible. Patricia Martinez became a reliable contact for future diplomatic correspondence, and her staff received additional training on protocols for processing official government mail. The postal office where everything started became a model facility for handling diplomatic communications with appropriate professional courtesy and security awareness. The Albania assignment became a case study in successful threat assessment and crisis response, used in training programs for new diplomatic security agents. The classified after-action report documented lessons learned and procedural improvements that enhance protection capabilities for American personnel in politically unstable regions worldwide. But the most significant outcome was personal rather than professional. For the first time in my career, I could approach challenging assignments with family support based on understanding rather than worry based on unknown concerns. My parents could follow news coverage of international situations with informed perspective on diplomatic security operations and appropriate pride in professional contributions to American personnel safety. The postal office incident had taught me that respect often comes through demonstration rather than explanation, that professional competence requires evidence rather than assertion, and that sometimes the most important revelations happen in the most ordinary places through the most routine interactions. Douglas had questioned my credentials because he couldn't imagine that someone my age and appearance could legitimately need diplomatic correspondence services. His assumptions had been challenged by evidence, his attitude had been transformed by demonstration, and his initial skepticism had inadvertently triggered changes that affected my career, my family relationships, and my understanding of professional identity. The story that began with condescending postal service and ended with successful diplomatic security operations illustrated everything I'd learned about the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of assumptions about their capabilities, the value of honest communication within appropriate boundaries, and the satisfaction that comes from work that protects others and serves purposes larger than individual advancement. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.